place of the voter forum with the candidates for Congress in Maine's 2nd District. The candidates are Attorney Tiffany Bond, who is running as an independent. The incumbent is Democratic Representative Jared Golden. And the Republican is former Congressman Bruce Poliquin. We welcome you all. For the next hour, we're going to be discussing issues of importance to the people of Maine and the 2nd District. We will not have strict time limits on our answers, but we do want to discuss as many topics as possible. Our time is precious, so I'm going to keep things moving and no filibustering allowed. If you've been in the House, you know you don't get to do that anyway. Each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing statement. Let's begin with Tiffany Bond, and the issue that's top of mind for most people is the economy. Mainers are coping with the highest rates of inflation in 4 decades, but inflation is also a global problem. So if you go to Congress, what steps would you propose and push for that might make a difference?
Well, a lot of our inflation right now is caused by supply chain issues because we are globally connected. And I hope that some of those have worked themselves out by the time I get there, because it won't be till January. But there are things that we can take, steps that we can take can make us more resilient. So for example, we got notice very recently of the mill in Jay closing. And instead of a lot of hemming and hawing, we should be looking at what Congress can do as far as maybe providing grants and loans that can be made available for us to rethink what those businesses can be used for. For example, manufacturing paper is not that different from manufacturing insulin. That might be a great facility for that. There's lots of free-flowing water. It might be wonderful for vertical agriculture. I apologize. And so, we should be going there with our problem-solving hats on to make a more diverse and robust economy, and I think that's the best way we can fight inflation overall.
Jared Golden, what kind of control does Congress have over this?
Thanks, Pat. Certainly, as you noted, there are some underlying issues out there, most of it coming out of COVID, the shutdowns, the impact on global supply chains, and such. But Congress can actually do a little bit to address that. Here's how. Let's talk about some of the things that I have supported in 2021 and 2022. A historic investment in America's infrastructure. That's the largest one in my lifetime, really the most historic since we did the Eisenhower highway system. That's investments in things like freight rail, our bridges, our roads, broadbands, not only good for creating jobs, but very necessary for addressing those supply chain hiccups, which are driving prices up. And also are just a huge inconvenience in our daily lives and to our commerce. Chips and Science Act, something that I also supported. This is going to accelerate the domestic manufacturing of semiconductor chips, key to making sure we're not dependent on China. This is in everything. All of the technologies of the future that our economy depends on are dependent on those semiconductor chips. So it's very important for the next several decades. Lastly, the Inflation Reduction Act, which I voted for, is going to help ensure American energy independence. This is more production of American oil and gas with technologies that are going to make it cleaner to use. But in that bill, we're also forcing the Biden administration to release leases on public lands for oil and gas drilling to increase production in the here and now, while making smart investments in things like battery storage, transmission, so that renewable energy will be more reliable in the future. All of this is going to address inflation.
Let me get to Bruce Poliquin on this and find out what's job one if you go back to Washington economically.
Stop this crazy, wasteful spending of trillions and trillions of dollars that is either borrowed or printed. That drives up inflation. Pat, I'm the only one on this stage who has 40 years of experience running businesses in the real world. I dealt with the economy, the real world economy every day, with interest rates, with the Federal Reserve, with spending, with debt, taxes, the whole ball of wax. And when you spend trillions of dollars, which is really this very extreme agenda that is Joe Biden's agenda, along with the majority party that controls everything in Washington, the Democrats, this is what you get. Now, here's the problem with this, is a few weeks ago when this, I call it the Higher Inflation Act, and some people call it the Inflation Reduction Act. It doesn't. $740 billion was the last piece of spending that took place, drives up inflation. The CBO reports that. It actually puts new taxes on the production of heating oil, gasoline, and natural gas, which drives up the cost of electricity. The cost of gasoline and heating oil is crushing us. So we've got to control spending. Job one for me, stop spending needlessly to drive down inflation.
Let's zero in on the heating oil question. As we've seen in the last year, the price of heating oil, the average has increased 72% over the last year. About 60% of Maine homes are heated with fuel oil. What is Congress doing about this, Jared Golden? How do you address this?
First of all, this week when I go down to Washington, hopefully we're going to get a deal on a continuing resolution to fund government through sometime in mid-December. As part of that package, I've been working with Senator Susan Collins and others to get more money for LIHEAP. Many people familiar with that. We're going to get $1 billion more right now, and we hope to get even more in December. That's money coming home to Maine to help people better afford how to heat their homes. I talked about forcing the Biden administration to release these permits for leases that have already been sold to oil and gas producers. In the short term, that's going to help. But we need to keep pushing here. So I have asked the president to continue releasing strategic oil reserves, something that he did, and I actually called for him to do several months ago, has helped drive down prices, but that ends in October. I think we need to continue pushing for that.
Is that the way to make a difference
Bruce,
here?
Real quick though, Pat, if I could, just something that Bruce said that's very important. He talked about the Inflation Reduction Act putting a gas on oil and gas. Not true. What we want is American oil and gas and American energy independence. That bill puts a tax on foreign oil from countries like Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. These are not countries that we want to be energy dependent on going into the future. So taxing imports from those countries is going to help prop up American oil and energy production here.
Let's talk about paying for heating oil this winter.
Yeah, this is clear, Pat, that that some folks on the stage just have no experience in the real world economy. Mr. Biden's first decision, or one of his first decisions, supported by this very extreme Green New Deal agenda a couple years ago, was to stop the Keystone Pipeline, other pipelines, and actually start to restrict our supply of producing domestic energy, heating oil, gasoline, and diesel. When you restrict the supply, the price goes through the roof. Now, when I was serving in Congress, we had the strongest economy in 50 years. We had the lowest unemployment rate, I think it was 2.8%, ever recorded in the state of Maine, and we did it almost with no inflation. Now, we have the highest inflation in 40 years. Instead of having $2 a gallon heating oil and gasoline, we have $4 and $5 a gallon. It's crushing our families.
Is increasing LIHEAP spending the only way to give quick relief here?
We need to reopen our supply of domestic energy to drive up the supply, down the price. And instead of this war on domestic energy, 2 years ago, Pat, we were energy independent. Now we're begging Venezuela and other countries in the Middle East to supply us energy when
Let's
we
let
have
Tiffany
it at home.
Bond weigh in on this. What do you do when you go to Congress? Well, you're not there now, but if you were, what would you say? We're going to get some relief from Maine who are trying to stay warm.
Here's the thing. I can't do anything till January, and realistically it would be several months after. These two gentlemen have raised millions of dollars where they could personally solve this problem for Mainers, but instead they've decided to torture you with commercials that you're probably seeing during this show. I think that they should be redirecting those investments towards our community and investing in our community. In fact, please don't give my campaign any money. Starting next month, I want you to take the same amount of money you give me if you like what you hear on stage. Please call your local town office and offer to contribute to the heating fund. Almost every town has one, and that way our seniors will not have to choose between food and heat this winter.
Let's talk about the challenges facing the lobster industry right now. It's been big news for the last few months, and it's going to continue to be. And we're facing a crisis in that industry because of new regulations from federal regulators who are trying to protect endangered right whales. First of all, do we have a responsibility to prevent a species from going extinct? And can we do that and still make sure that our lobstermen are able to pursue their livelihoods? Bruce, yeah.
Yes, of course we can. When I was serving in Congress, Pat, I would stand up all the time for all of our small business owners in the state of Maine and actually work really hard to remove 8 to 20% tariffs that the European Union was imposing on lobster fishermen. It happened after I'd left, but we started under when I was there. Now, right now, we have these very extreme environmental groups that now I hate to say this, but that support Jared Golden and donate to Jared Golden. And he supports, along with the Democrats, these punitive regulations on our lobster industry that including putting windmills in the Gulf of Maine where we fish, and now trying to push towards lobster fishermen using ropeless traps. I don't know how they're going to do that, But the problem we've had with the right whale, Pat, is that in Canada, along the Gulf of Mexico, they've had ship strikes, cruise ship strikes. We haven't had a problem with right whales
But
in the Gulf of Maine
in
15
Massachusetts
years.
this week, there's video of a whale entangled in somebody's lines.
Not
we
a
don't
right
know whose they
whale.
are. But
Not
that's
a
the
right
question.
whale.
Do we have a responsibility to protect them, and is there a way to do it? And
Bottom line, going back to 2004, there is not one identified whale entanglement in Maine lobster gear, period. That's it. There's never been one documented that resulted in the fatality of a whale. These are unbelievably unjustified regulations. It's the worst example of unfair, unjustified federal regulations I've ever seen. I got to address, of course, Bruce talking about donations and saying that I support these regulations. First of all, his campaign tweeted out about a specific donation today. That came from the executive director of the Monterey Aquarium, and they are affiliated with a group called Seafood Watch. Of course, Maine viewers are familiar that they've put a red flag on Maine lobsters, the Maine lobster fishery. Bruce called on me to give the money back. Why would I do that? Now, this is a woman who runs an organization who would use that money to further bring lawsuits against Maine's lobster fishery.
it's symbolic.
So instead, I take the money, Pat, and here's what I have done in regards to my record. First of all, I sent a letter to her just a few weeks ago. Here's what we said. This was a reckless piece of activism, we said. This isn't science, it's irresponsible conjecture, a baseless smear and an egregious violation of the scientific principles that you claim to stand for. So the entire delegation is fighting against this. We've done so repeatedly. Now I'm working with Senator Angus King's office to try and find any source of federal funding that aquarium gets in an effort to block it in next year's funding bills. I think that's important.
I want to let Tiffany Bond weigh in on this one. As we have this discussion about protecting whales and protecting the lobster industry, can you do both?
You know, it's always a balancing act. My husband fished commercially for years. In fact, when we met, that's what he did. And I think that fisheries change over time, and there's going to have to be a lot of adjustments made as climate change occurs. This is just the very first little bit in what's going to be a very difficult journey for our lobstermen. And we need people that are dedicated to watching the science and seeing how it matches up. I haven't had the opportunity to read the court briefs in this, but right now it's playing out in the court. And the fact of the matter is there's nothing I could do about it until the court case concludes, or really anybody can because they're currently litigating. But we do need to have people in Congress who balance the needs of our changing climate with the needs of our economy. And, you know, who better to do that than somebody who's had that experience in their own household?
Bottom line, when people give me...
I need to set the record straight here. When Mr. Golden voted a few weeks ago for this $740 billion monstrosity that's going to increase the cost of inflation,
and it's going to reduce the deficit by $300 billion.
It's going to reduce our supplies of energy, which is going to drive up the price of everything. He also voted to increase funding for NOAA. This is the very same agency that is responsible for implementing these punitive regulations.
How would defunding them help?
Well, you certainly do not increase funding on the organization, the entity that's going to place these lobstermen and threaten their lives. You don't do that. Mr. Golden did that. His Green New Deal agenda is becoming very, very clear to all of us, Pat, is that punitive regulations on businesses, higher energy costs because you restrict the supply, and now he's threatening, along with others, the lobster fishing industry.
We've got to move on. Last word on this.
Bottom line, when people give me money, they support me, not the other way around. I support Maine lobstermen. Here's what I've done. I've called on President Trump and President Biden to block these regulations. Neither did it. I put an amendment on the House floor to defund the ability of that agency to move forward with these rules. His Republican leadership, Kevin McCarthy, who he wants to be Speaker, voted against that amendment. I've helped with working with Susan Collins get our lobster fishery $17 million to try and offset the cost of these regulations. I'm dead set against it, and when I'm back in Congress next year, I'm going to keep fighting against it every day.
I want to move on. We've had a lot of questions from viewers, and clearly there's only so much time. But here's the first one, and this is from David Wardrop. And he asked, would you agree that having two major political parties creates divisiveness among the general public? And can you give 3 examples of where you've crossed party lines for the benefit of Maine? Now, Tiffany Bond, we'll start with you. You haven't been in Congress, so crossing party lines might not be the same thing. But what are your thoughts on what he has to say?
Well, we can clearly see this is why we're getting nothing done at this point in time. And I feel like I'm with all the viewers right now watching it. It's a lot. We need to be looking at Congress as What I describe myself as is moderate. I don't think of moderate so much as a political position as much as a process in working through it. You take the amount of time and resources both man hours and financial support, you need to support a project. You add in a little bit of buffer and you create solutions collaboratively that fix that. That's not what we're doing right now. We're bickering. And I think, my day job is as a divorce attorney. I work with people that cannot stand each other. And if you can go down and collaborate and get people to see their win in a perhaps slightly flawed document, we can actually get some stuff done.
Jared Golden, give us a couple of examples where you've crossed the aisle.
Sure. Look, here's the thing. Everyone's watching tonight. Tiffany, myself, Bruce, we're all very passionate about public service, and so we are going to have a good, fierce debate tonight. I wouldn't describe it as bickering. I certainly don't feel that way about either one of them. I agree with the caller's question. I do think that the country would be well served to have more parties. I happen to be a member of the Democratic Party, but I don't think we have all the answers, Pat. So I've supported publicly semi-open primaries, which is a new law here in the state of Maine, which is going to open up primaries for independent voters to be able to have a voice in that primary system. But here's what I want to point out. For specifics, the bipartisan Lugar Center has ranked me the 7th most bipartisan member of Congress. That's out of 435 people in the House of Representatives, Pat. That's an extremely strong record of bipartisan.
And Bruce Poliquin, you served a couple of terms. When did you cross the aisle?
Well, first of all, let's set the record straight here. My opponent, Mr. Golden, votes 92% of the time with the Democrat majority. He votes more than 80% of the time with AOC, Nancy Pelosi, and Joe Biden. So he tries
what was your voting with the Republican Party?
He tries to sell himself as a moderate. He's not. When I was working and serving the people of the 2nd District in Congress, I spent 2 years with Nikki Tsongas, who was a Democrat from Massachusetts, to force the United States Pentagon to buy athletic shoes that are American-made 100% here in the state of Maine. That's 1,000 jobs, Pat, in the state of Maine at our New Balance factories. That's the first example. Second.
Well, I'm going to have to cut you off because we got to take a break. And Tempest Fugit, we'll be back with more of our Voice of the Voter Forum with the candidates for Congress in Maine's 2nd District right after this. Back to our NewsCenter Maine Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum. We're talking with the people who are running for Congress in Maine's 2nd District. They are independent Tiffany Bond. The incumbent is Democrat Jared Golden, and the challenger from the Republican Party is former Congressman Bruce Poliquin. We've had a lot of questions from viewers, and many of them address the same issues, and I've got several that can really be answered with yes or no answers. So if we can do that and run through some of those, I think people will be happy to hear from you. So we'll start with this one. Should members of Congress be barred from trading stocks while in office?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, and I never have. Yes.
Do you support term limits for members of Congress?
No.
Yes.
Absolutely.
How long would they be? What would you set for a term limit?
2 for the United States Senate, and let's see, and 6 for the House of Representatives. 12 years, plenty of time. Go back home.
I'd say somewhere around 3 or 4 in the House and probably 1 or 2 in the Senate, Pat.
If this race goes, what?
Can I tell you why not?
Yeah, sure.
Well, unfortunately, we're asking people to step out of their careers at their peak earning years. If we put term limits in, not only do we give lobbyists the advantage, but we restrict running for Congress to all but the most wealthy of us, and we don't have the right people making decisions.
If this race goes to a ranked choice tabulation, will you accept the results of that?
Of course.
Absolutely.
Of course. Just go vote. Everyone's got to vote, Pat.
Is Maine's election system secure and fair?
Yes.
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 And was President Biden's election legitimate?
Yes.
Yes.
There were irregularities, but I trust the people of Maine the way they voted, trust the people in the country.
Okay. Let's talk about another big issue that people ask us a lot about. I want to make sure we get this in. The Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade left reproductive rights to the states. However, dozens of Republican members of Congress have signed on to proposals to pass a federal ban on most abortions. One is the Heartbeat Protection Act. We don't need to get into the details, but the question is, and we'll start with Congressman Golden, would you support a federal ban on abortion or lesser reproductive rights restrictions?
No, Pat. I am pro-choice. This is a very personal and private matter, and I support a woman's right to make that choice for herself. I'm going to get out ahead of the attacks that have been put out there against me on this issue, claiming that I support late-term abortions right up to the point, the day of birth. and even suggested that I voted for that. I have not, and that's not true. I don't support late-term abortions. What I do support is access to abortion services up to the point of viability, and this is the key point, as determined by a medical professional. That is the state of Maine law right there, and that's what I support.
Bruce Poliquin?
Yes, I am pro-life, Pat, and very proud of it. I have always stood up for life, all life, and religious liberties. When our son was 17 months old, about Jared's same age as Jared's daughter, my wife died tragically, and I raised Sammy as a single dad. So I understand how precious and how fragile life is. So I'm pro-life and proud of it. Now, that being said, the Supreme Court has made a decision under the Constitution. They have this authority to pull this decision from the courts, unelected judges, send it back to we the people in Maine and the other 49 states. So let the people of Maine decide. The people of Maine, if I may, the people of Maine 30 years ago decided to allow abortion up until viability. Excuse me. I trust the people of Maine. They've made that decision. But I do disagree with Jared Golden, who has voted for a national law that wipes out all state laws and does, in fact, allow late-term abortions. He's voted for that bill twice,
but the question
which
on
is
the
passed the
table
House.
is, if Congressman, if someone in Congress, perhaps your party, proposes a ban, would you vote for it or against it and say no, leave it to the states?
No, leave it to the states. Let
So
the
you would
people of
vote
Maine.
against it?
I trust the people of Maine. They've weighed in. Let them continue to weigh in. The best government is the government closest to home. I trust the people of Maine.
Let's go to another question from a viewer. And
Does
this
the
is
woman get to answer that question?
I'm sorry, I did not. I apologize. I lose track sometimes.
No, that's all right. I'm happy to remind you. Poliquin actually voted for a heartbeat bill that didn't care about what the fetus could feel or think. Shame on all of us for letting politicians convince us that by judging our neighbors and their private decisions, they could fundraise more money off of us. This should not be legislated at all, including late-term terminations, which are not women who are harlots willy-nilly running around getting pregnant and terminating 8 months. Those are families that are grieving the loss of very wanted children, and every single time you inject the government in those decisions, you cause pain and death. Shame on all of us for allowing this to become a political issue.
Thank you. D. Leonard of Waterford writes, candidates for the U.S. House and Senate are increasingly distant from their constituents. Will you pledge the following? To hold on a quarterly basis a session with constituents in person or on radio where people can ask unscreened questions, and to annually hold a town hall style meeting in person in each county in the 2nd District. Bruce Poliquin, you go first.
Great idea. When I was serving, I did similar strategies. I traveled the district constantly. I slept in my office, Pat, for 4 years on a Murphy bed because I didn't want to become part of the mess. Came back on the weekends, traveled extensively in the largest district east of the Mississippi River. We had telephone town halls. I met with constituents on a regular basis, and I'm doing it now. This is not a career for me. I've had a career in business for 40 years. I understand the problems we have. I know how to fix them. I'm doing this because our country and our state, which I love, is in deep trouble. We've got to make a change. If we do not make a change, all these problems get worse.
Tiffany Bond.
You know, maybe this should be a career. I mean, we have decades of legislative neglect, and I want somebody who shows up on time, prepared, ready to work with constituents, ready to do the job, gets continuing education, and works like their retirement depends on it. I am the only candidate here who's doing 2 virtual town halls per week. In fact, join me tonight at 8 o'clock immediately following this. It's on youtube.com/Tiffany Bond. I'll also post a link on Twitter, and I will answer your questions, unscripted, whatever you're interested in asking, because that's what you deserve from a representative.
Excellent pitch. Congressman Golden.
We've done town halls, Pat. I've done them in places like Millinocket, up in the county, over in Farmington, Ellsworth. I enjoy doing those. I enjoy meeting with my constituents. Of course, we do coffee hours. We have many constituents into the office. I have found that when you have these in person often, it's hit or miss. Sometimes you can get 100 people, sometimes you get 10.
But they want to see you and they want to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely. And what I've embraced the most, something Bruce talked about, is telephone town halls. You're able with that platform to reach thousands of people. On average, I will have upwards of 1,000 to 5,000 or more
And
participants.
unscreened questions.
We let all these questions through over the course of an hour. Not only do I do these by myself often, I will ask someone like Dana Connors from the Chamber of Commerce, someone from the SBA, or from the Maine Credit Union League to join me if we're going to have a specific conversation about access to capital or about small businesses, whatever it may be, have a professional there with me to also field questions.
We touched in the first segment on the Inflation Reduction Act and what impact it may have on the economy, but it also makes the largest ever U.S. investment in fighting climate change. It aims to cut emissions by giving a big boost to the development of clean technology. Tiffany Bond, we'll start with you in this round. Do you support it, and what specific steps do you want to take next? What would you do?
So I actually have the act in my bag. I haven't made it through it yet because it's several hundred pages. What I can say is I've read the marketing sheet put out by Democrats, recognizing that it's a marketing sheet and it sounds good. I do think that we need much more robust investments in clean tech, which will help provide wonderful jobs, living wage jobs for Mainers. I also think there's some hiring, and one of the things that's come up a lot online is there's talking about hiring of IRS agents. What I'd really like to do is see us take some of those hiring positions and shift them to have that be where we manage fraud for social services, so we can focus our social service agencies on really providing services to people in need.
But focusing on the impact on the climate through this bill, what would you do next? For example, there's a bill that's floating around. I think Senator Joe Manchin has been pushing it to make sure we improve our transmission capacity, make it easier to license new lines, because if we want to go electric vehicles and everything else, you've got to have a way to get that power to the people.
You know, Pat, on this bill, there are millions of dollars of attack ads being spent to mislead the people of Maine about the contents of this bill. I think that we could talk about the climate aspects. We should also spend some time to talk about the healthcare aspects, and we should talk about how it's paid for. So hopefully we might be able to fit that in.
We'll try to do that.
I'll start with this. It's a $440 billion investment that is completely paid for, and on top of that will reduce the deficit by over $300 billion, something that has not been done by any Congress in decades. Now, in regards to energy, I've already pointed out that this is going to work towards increasing oil and gas production, investing in technologies like carbon capture to make it more affordable for manufacturers and other businesses to be able to use those sources of energy cleaner. We are investing in our ability to store energy and to transmit it, very important for the future of renewable energy, so that we know that it's reliable and that it can deliver on demand, which is what we rely on right now with oil and gas. It's going to also build domestic supply chains that we don't have in America right now. We're dependent on China for things that are in our solar panels. We're dependent on China for the parts that are in wind technology. When it comes to talking about electrifying the grid, we're dependent on them for batteries. That's not American energy independence unless we bring it home, and it's got to be made by Americans for America, and that's what this bill is investing in. We've already done what you're talking about, which is the transmission investment. Mm-hmm. What Joe Manchin is talking about that I support is permitting reform to make it easier for pipelines like Bruce talked about, the Dakota pipeline, things like the Mountain West natural gas pipeline, which I support. We want to see those things get approved and get that natural gas into the market to bring down prices now.
Bruce Poliquin, you accept that climate change is a real problem. What do you want to do about it?
Well, first of all, what we need to do is make sure we recognize that here in the state of Maine, our climate, our environment is critical to our survival as a state. 160,000 workers are directly related to the hospitality business, Pat. And so keeping our climate and our environment clean is critical. I'm very proud of my votes to keep our air and water clean. When I was a kid growing up in central Maine, and my parents are from central Maine, my grandparents are from central Maine, if you fell in the Kennebec River, you needed a tetanus shot. So I get it. Now, one of the things that we need to make sure we do is not subsidize people to buy electric vehicles and solar panels. They're very expensive. If they want to do it, God bless them. But this $740 billion Higher Inflation Act that Mr. Golden just voted for provides subsidies for those activities. I don't think we need to subsidize people if you can't afford them yourself. And if I may also, the bill also includes, if you can believe this, has nothing to do with the climate. It includes hiring 87,000 additional IRS employees. Well, what the heck do you think they're going to be doing? They're going to be auditing the middle class, which is where the money is. I believe all forms of energy, don't tax energy to drive up the price. Don't add to our inflation to keep inflation down. And one more thing I might add that we haven't talked about, Pat. We need to secure our border. This is a major issue. We need to talk about that.
I do want to get to that, but I do want to point out, get specific about this 87,000 IRS agents. That's over 10 years, filling vacancies that already exist. Should that not happen? Do we not need somebody?
I will get specific about this, Pat. First of all, Joe Manchin talked in an interview with Maine news sources, sitting right next to me, where he talked about how this, as a pay-for, giving more money to the IRS, was first proposed by Republicans who were talking about how to pay for the infrastructure bill that we did. It's also an important bill for our nation's economy. Now, for my constituents, and there are 10 million backlogs in tax returns right now. A lot of people here in Maine, thousands in my district, are owed a tax return. Right now, the IRS can take 1 in 10 phone calls. 1 in 10 phone calls. They can't even get through to people to get an answer about where is their tax return. What is the status of their tax filing? Now, as you have pointed out, over the last 5 years, they have watched their workforce decrease by 35,000 people. Half of their workforce will be retirement ready in the next 5 years. Now, this is really important, enforcement to make sure that taxes get paid. Who pays their taxes? Hardworking middle-class people like us, Pat. Who doesn't? Now, since the 2017 tax law, which was not paid for, a $5 trillion add to our country's deficit, this bill reduces the deficit. Here are the facts. Since 2017, 26 companies, multinational companies that make more than $1 billion in gross net annual profits, have not paid 1 penny. They've paid 0 in federal taxes.
We have an enforcement problem. Should we be going after that money?
I'd like to respond to this.
The tax laws exist. Let's enforce them, right?
Pat, wait a minute. When I was serving in Congress, we passed the biggest tax cut ever in the history of the United States. It led to, in deregulation, it led to the strongest economy in 50 years, the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded, as I mentioned, and we did it almost with no inflation. All of this spending, all of this taxes, higher energy prices are killing our economy. We are now in a recession. And when it comes to these IRS agents, I don't believe in rewarding incompetence. These folks, a lot of them, half of them, Susan Collins said, are working from home. They're not answering the phone. They have 10 or 15 million filings that are backlogged. Why in the heck would we want to reward that? We just have a different way of looking at this. I would also say, Pat, the Congressional Budget Office says $20 billion of additional taxes will be paid by the middle class because of increased audits. That is wrong. Leave the people of Maine and our small businesses alone and people struggling.
I want to point out that the Trump-appointed IRS commissioner, who's still in that role, has testified under oath in front of the United States Senate that not 1 penny of that money given to the IRS by this legislation will be used to do a single audit on any household making less than $400,000.
Let's get the last word on this from you.
Well, the bill that Bruce Poliquin loves to brag about was a really bad bill that had a lot of gotchas that came later, and also made it so separating families in Maine have fewer resources to work with because it taxes spousal support differently. So I don't know that I'd be real proud of that bill. And as somebody who's trying to close out an estate of a client who sadly passed, I've sat on the phone with the IRS for hours. We need them doing their job.
All right, we need to take a break, and we'll be back with more of our Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum with the candidates for Congress in Maine's 2nd District right after this. Welcome back to our Voice of the Voter Candidate Forum with the men and women who are running for Congress in Maine's 2nd District. They are Republican Bruce Poliquin, Democrat Jared Golden, and Independent Tiffany Bond. It was interesting in a survey that came out last week asking about voter priorities. The economy was number 1 by far. Second was the threat to democracy that people are seeing happen in this country right now. So let me ask you, Bruce Poliquin, both parties claim democracy is being threatened right now. What would you support doing to reassure people and fix this system? For example, the Electoral Count Reform Act that is in the works, hasn't been voted on yet. Is that something you would support?
Well, I want to make sure that everybody is comfortable with the fact that here in the 2nd District, they need to go out and vote. It's critically important. It's our constitutional right, and ranked choice voting will be part of how we vote, Pat. So I'm asking folks just to fill in Bruce Poliquin in your first choice. If you want to rank me first, second, and third choice, that's fine. They both count. But you do not have to rank the candidates.
But this is bigger than Maine. If you're in Congress and you want to reassure the country that yes, our system works, our democracy is going to be protected from this threat, what do you do? Well,
I would not vote what Mr. Golden voted for, which was to nationalize all elections. In other words, a federal law that would prevent the state of Maine and the other states from controlling how the elections are conducted and how the votes are counted. Now, the bill that he voted for, which I think is very wrong, Jared, first of all, it provides about $7 million to congressional candidates to fund their campaigns. Well, we're struggling in how to pay for our heating oil and groceries. Second of all, it would really institutionalize live mail-in ballots. We saw what a problem that was, Pat. I don't mean applications for an absentee ballot. I mean live mail-in ballots. I think that's really wrong. It would also water down voter ID laws across the state. I think the state of Maine does a very good job keeping our elections safe and secure. We do not need the federal government getting in our way and wiping out our state laws and taking over how we vote and how we count the votes. But that's what my opponent voted for.
Tiffany Bond, what would you do to try to reassure the country that our system is going to persevere?
I think the single most important thing we could do, and this is something that the Maine Constitution is brilliant on. In Maine, we have a constitutional right to vote. It can't be taken away. So if you have criminal convictions, if you're charged with things, if you're on probation, it can't be removed. And we've seen a lot of weaponizing of making felonies in many states so that your political enemies can't vote. It's not appropriate. I think that nationally we should mirror the Constitution of Maine, and we should have a constitutional amendment to protect voting.
Jared Golden.
Well, Maine voters have not once but twice chosen public financing for candidates that opt to accept that and then take a corresponding pledge not to take any other source of funding, Pat. Big money in politics is a threat to our democracy. And I do support overturning Citizens United, getting rid of all these super PACs, dark money 501c4s. These are all important things. Reforming our system to find ways to get rid of the corruption where it does exist. Any bit is unacceptable. So banning members from trading stocks, yes. Finding ways to crack down on foreign money that is getting into our political system, yes, I support that. I've supported semi-open primaries to get more people voting and have a voice in these primaries, which are making our elections more extreme because it's so controlled by the two parties, the Republican and Democratic parties. And I support things like the Electoral Count Act, which of course Susan Collins is leading on in the Senate. We just passed a version very similar in the House. I think these two things are going to come together, and that's important because what happened on January 6th is completely unacceptable, Pat. It can never happen again.
Let's talk for a couple of minutes about immigration policy. And the U.S. has not had significant immigration policy reform since the Reagan administration. What would be your priority in working on immigration reform? Can you even start with what some people say is the simplest thing, the dreamers, the young people who have been brought here by their parents through no fault of their own but have grown up as Americans? Can they get permanent residency? Can they get a path to citizenship?
That one for me?
Yes.
I don't believe in a world without redemption, and that's what we currently have in immigration law right now. It's not appropriate. This is one of those areas that has massive legislative neglect. We need to entirely rework our system, and that includes if people are out of compliance, getting the way to get in compliance. You shouldn't have any status for which you just can never, ever, ever come back. And we also need to make it so it's a fair and equitable system. Right now we have people waiting 10, 20, 30 years to get connected with their family, to be part of that family unit again. And that's not what America was founded on. That's not how my family came over. That's not how any of our family came over here. We should be giving those same opportunities to others.
Now, both of you have served in Congress, so you know there seems to be no appetite in Congress for addressing this issue in a serious way. What would you do?
Obviously, comprehensive immigration reform is something that needs to happen, Pat. As you pointed out, there's been failed efforts in the past that have fallen apart, and it's become very difficult to make bipartisan progress on this. It has to be done in a bipartisan way. We have a business community that says that we need to improve our immigration system to get more workers to America. We have workforce shortages. We have people that understand, obviously, all over the country, that having people here who are illegally here, working under the table, in the shadows, not able to do things like pay taxes, is a big problem. And we need to get them, they are depressing people's wages. You know, this is a big problem amongst the labor community. It's a big problem amongst industries like construction, other kind of trades type work. We need to find a way to do something about that. But it obviously has to be coupled with border security. I know that Bruce is going to attack me on this. I just want to point out, just to put this to rest as soon as possible. In 4 years in Congress, Bruce voted for $60 billion in border security funding. In 4 years, I have voted for $100 billion. Okay, I voted for over $4 billion for the border wall. He voted for about $1 billion.
Bruce Palmer, what's your priority when you get?
Priority is making sure we secure our border and enforce our existing immigration laws, Pat. The first thing that Joe Biden did, well, one of the first things he did with the support of the very extreme Democrat Party, they're in the majority, they control everything now, Pat. First thing they did, one of the first things they did was invite everybody to America. And even if you come here illegally, most of those folks have been allowed to stay. So now we have, in the last couple of years, since Joe Biden and his Democrats run everything, we have about 4 million people in this country illegally. We don't know who they are, but they've been allowed to stay for the most part. And then on top of that, we have a flood of fentanyl, 90% of which has come over the southwest border. They are now working. The Chinese who produce this and the cartels who smuggle this across the border are now developing rainbow-colored fentanyl pills to attract our kids. I went to the border, Pat, in January. I don't think Mr. Golden or Ms. Bond have been at the border. I met with the Border Patrol agents. 70% of them are not guarding the border because they are overwhelmed by this flood of illegals coming to this country. Let me finish, Pat. Here's the other problem. We have a housing problem in the state of Maine. I was at the Greek Festival in Lewiston a couple weeks ago. I met this wonderful woman who was waiting on the tables, and I said, "Where do you live?" She pointed to the parking lot. She lives in the car with her 2 cats. I said, "You've got to go to the housing authority." She said, "Bruce, I have. I got bumped down the list because folks have come in this country illegally and now push me down." I believe in securing the border, standing up for Maine first, America first, and my opponents do not.
And what about a path to citizenship for the Dreamers, which was part of the question?
Say it one more time, please.
A path to citizenship for the young people who were brought here by their families, who have grown up as Americans, don't know the foreign country their family came from. What do you do for them?
You secure the border first. You stop the bleeding. Once you secure the border first, and we don't have this flood of people who we don't know who they are, and this flood of fentanyl, I think that will change, Pat, the dynamics down in Congress where people can get together and make a good decision. First step, enforce the border. My opponent has done nothing to protect this.
Last word on this.
Very important. Now, I am the lead sponsor, working with Tony Gonzalez from Texas, a Republican. He lives in a border community, of a bill to block Biden's moves as they relate to Title 42. This is what Bruce is talking about, opening up the border. I am against that, and I'm leading the charge against it. My bill would say that Biden can't do that until there's a plan put forward by the Commissioner of DHS. I trust the professionals in uniform in ICE and in the Border Patrol and CBP. That's why I voted for more funding for border security than Bruce did in the same time frame. 4 years each, I have voted for more. So this is a non-issue. Bruce is trying to turn it into a political weapon.
When I was serving in Congress, we had the most secure.
I agree with him about the fentanyl.
When I was serving,
very important that we need to crack down on that.
When I was serving in Congress, Pat, he mentioned me. I should have a chance to respond. Sure. Thank you. When I was serving in Congress, we had the most secure border in 30 years. During the time my opponent's been there, this border has been wide open the last couple of years. We are flooded with people that we have to take care of. Housing, food, clothing, transportation. What about Maine citizens? What about Americans first? I believe that. Secure the border. This is a top priority for me, and this is one of the key things that we will fix when I get back down there. We need to bring some common sense.
Let's move on from this. I think we've spent all the time we're going to. I want to skip to another subject, and that is, do you support student loan forgiveness by the federal government?
No, I've already come out against that. I think that was a terrible mistake, and I think that the lawsuit that was brought forward today will be successful.
No, of course not. What if you didn't go to college? You got to pay for someone who did that might be making more money? No, you shouldn't forgive student loans. But I'll tell you, the reason we have these problems, Pat, Mr. Golden is part of this majority that's enabling all of this to happen. He votes more than 80% of the time with Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and AOC, he votes 92% of the time with a Democrat majority. We need to bring some common sense back to Washington, folks that understand the business community, the real world community, which I do. We did not have these problems when I was there. I know how to fix this. We need to make a change.
Tiffany Bond, do you support student loan forgiveness?
So I don't think the solution that we're using is right. Right now we have predatory loans that can't really be forgiven in any way through bankruptcy process for students. And though I appreciate there was an attempt to whack off some of those student loans, it didn't fix the problem. And it's not even really a Band-Aid. So what we should be doing is we extend to our banks 0% interest all the time. I think that our students' contribution to their education of paying tuition and their time out of the workforce is adequate. The loans should be at 0% interest. We should credit for interest paid. We should credit for interest accrued, and we should credit for interest capitalized. That would resolve the problem for nearly all nearly all students who have borrowed. And it would also allow us to get professionals in our rural communities. I'm trying to open my practice or move my practice out to Franklin County. It is virtually impossible when you have student loans to build a practice. We're not going to have therapists, teachers, doctors, dentists, or lawyers in our rural communities if we don't have a way to address the predatory interest.
This is something that spun out of the Supreme Court's decision on Roe versus Wade. It has people asking, do other rights need to be codified and protected? So Bruce Poliquin, I'd ask you, there's a marriage equality bill that is right now on hold, probably till after the election. Would you support codifying into law the right to same-sex marriage and interracial marriage?
Well, we have that now, if I'm not mistaken, Pat. Okay.
But that can change with a Supreme Court decision, apparently, which just happened with Roe versus Wade.
Well, this is you're putting the cart before the horse. I support the Constitution. I support the role of the Supreme Court. Let's see, in fact, what they do. I'm a French-Canadian Catholic from Central Maine. 40 years in the business community, get along with everybody in a bipartisan way. I believe everybody is special. I treat everybody with dignity and respect, my opponents or not, and I will do what is right. This is not my career. I am doing this because our country is in deep trouble, and the people of Maine can trust me to do what's right.
Tiffany Bond, do we need a marriage equality law on the books?
Yes, if you wait for the court to strike something down, you are passing the buck on doing your job legislating, and you cause harm to people while they're waiting with an uncertain future.
Jared Golden?
Yes, I support that wholeheartedly, as do the people of Maine. They voted for that, as you know, Pat.
Finally, wrap up with a sort of a philosophical question, I guess. When you don't know enough about an issue and how you would vote on it, who do you turn to? Who gives you guidance? Who gives you advice? Or do you just rely on yourself and learning about the issues at hand? Tiffany Bond.
Well, I'm fortunate that I work in a place and a way where I get to know a lot of the issues firsthand. I work tremendously with our social support network, with taxes, retirement, student loan issues, health care, whether or not we have the welfare supports we need. But there are areas that I think that you do phone a friend, and I think you phone more than one friend. I think you get a comprehensive point of view by checking with multiple professionals with different perspectives, and that's how you make well-rounded law.
Jared Golden, who do you reach out to?
First and foremost, my constituents, Pat. We do that through a number of ways, and I call some of them individually even, people that I've formed a good relationship with through the years. But in addition, I talk to my colleagues, of course. I talk with Susan Collins and Angus King. I talk with Shelley Pingree. And lastly, my staff really digs in, and we sit down and we do briefings. We pour through these bills, and then we make very tough decisions. And then, most importantly, we communicate that process and how we made that decision out to my constituents after the vote.
And Bruce Poliquin.
I reach out to the people of Maine, Pat. People of Maine have more common sense than any of the folks that I know in this country. There's clearly no common sense down in Washington now. So when we had a tough issue, whether it deal with the fisheries or the wood products industry or what have you, we have groups of individuals and like our veterans. I was on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and I formed a Veterans Advisory Panel. So we would talk with them on a monthly basis to make sure I know what they're thinking about, what's helping and what is not helping on the ground in Maine, because when you serve in this capacity, you work for the people of Maine. They're our customers, and I listen to them, I believe them, and I trust them.
They're the boss.
Well, no, they are the boss.
Right.
In our representative republic, the people of the state of Maine who are going to vote for one of us in the 2nd District, they are the boss.
We want to now offer each of our candidates 1 minute for a closing statement. We begin with Independent Tiffany Bond.
So we have been stuck in this icky place that is the bickering and the interrupting and the over-talking and trying to get little clips that can be used on social media to beg you for money that you don't have and they've acknowledged you don't have in your grocery budget so that they can play more commercials to torture you. We don't have to do that anymore. We have ranked choice voting. You can safely pick me first to go be a professional that represents you and takes the job seriously and looks at unconventional solutions. If you like what you've heard today, do a Maine raising, go invest in the community. And if you want to talk more about it, please come find me online right now.
Independent candidate Tiffany Bond, thank you for that. Next is the incumbent, the Democrat, Jared Golden.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you to the viewers and to both Bruce and Tiffany for joining me tonight. It has been an incredible honor to represent the people of Maine's 2nd District. Less than 12,000 Americans have done this in the history of our country, and I am just so deeply honored to have had this opportunity. No one has been a more fierce independent voice for you. I have voted against the Biden administration more than any other Democrat in Congress. I voted against my own party more than any other Democrat in Congress. I do that proudly for you. I go down there to work for you each and every day. I take it very seriously. I'm very proud of that. I don't know how long I'll be doing this. I got a young family, but I do know that I'd like to do it for another 2 years. Nothing's going to change me. I'm going to keep fighting for you, and I'm asking for your vote once again in November. Thank you all so much for being who you are and for this opportunity to represent you.
Democratic Congressman Jared Golden, thank you for that. And finally, the Republican is former Congressman Bruce Poliquin.
I love the people of Maine. I love our state. I love our country. Politics is not my career. I've had a career in business, 40 years running small businesses I've worked really hard for. I've come out of semi-retirement because our state and our country is in deep trouble. Now, you have a path here. You have a choice here in the voters of the 2nd District. If you like the path that we're on, out of control in spending, the highest inflation in 40 years, heating oil and gasoline prices we can't afford, and an open border, the folks that we have to now take care of, then you can make that decision and keep what you got. If you want to make a change, I represent that difference. We will stop this out of control spending to drive down inflation. We will reopen the supplies of oil and natural gas and gasoline to drive down the price, and we will secure our border to make sure we take care of America first. I appreciate your vote on November 8th. Thank you very much.
Republican Bruce Poliquin, thank you for that. Our thanks to all of the candidates for being with us this evening. Our next NewsCenter Maine Voice of the Voter Forum is coming up on Wednesday, October 19th. That's when we'll hear from the candidates for Congress in District 1, Shelley Pingree and Ed Thielander. And the following week, on Thursday, October 27th, in cooperation with the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, we will host a forum with the candidates for governor, Janet Mills and Paul LePage. So stay with NewsCenter Maine for Voice of the Voter election coverage right up until Election Day, November 8th and beyond. For all of us here at NewsCenter Maine, thank you for joining us, and good night.